Kwame had spent years working 3 tough jobs in Accra, saving every cedi just to buy the car of his dreams, a shining cherry-red Maserati. To him, it wasn't just a car, it was proof that all his sweat and sleepless nights had finally paid off. But the joy didn't last. The moment he brought it home, his parents decided it wasn't really his. Without asking him a single word, they sold the car and used the money to send his sister Amma on a luxury vacation to Dubai. At dinner, while Kwame sat there still in shock, Amma returned with a proud smirk, dropping stories about beaches and parties, showing off her designer bags like trophies. His parents looked pleased with themselves and declared, "We did it for family," as if that settled everything. The word stung. Kwame could feel his fists tighten under the table, his heart pounding in his chest. They had taken the one thing he worked so hard for, not because they needed it, but just to spoil Amma. Everyone at the table expected him to smile, to play the role of the quiet, responsible son who never complained. But inside, his blood was boiling. They didn't see him as a man with dreams or feelings. They only saw him as a tool, someone to sacrifice again and again. At that moment, Kwame made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about respect, and they had just crossed the line. The table was full of laughter, but none of it reached Kwame. His parents were busy praising Amma for how beautiful she looked in her new clothes. Amma herself was glowing, showing everyone her shiny designer bags as if they were medals she had won. Kwame sat there quietly, his plate untouched. Everyone around him thought they knew exactly what he would do. They thought he would stay silent, smile, and accept everything, just like always. After all, Kwame was the responsible one, the son who never argued, the one who carried the family's burdens without ever raising his voice. But inside, Kwame was not calm. His fists were clenched so tightly under the table that his knuckles turned white. For years, he had been treated like a machine, like an endless bank account that could give but never feel. His dreams, his struggles, his sacrifices had always been ignored. No one asked him what he wanted, no one cared about his hard work, and yet they always expected him to carry the family on his back. That car was more than just metal and wheels to him. It was his pride, his achievement, proof that his sleepless nights and long shifts had meant something. And in one thoughtless act, they had stolen it from him, sold it behind his back, and celebrated as if they had done something noble. Kwame's heart burned, not only with anger but with a deep pain that words couldn't carry. They had not just taken away his car, they had stripped away his respect. Every smirk from Amma and every proud word from his parents felt like salt on an open wound. He could feel his jaw tighten as his mind began to race. In that silence, as they laughed and ate, he started to plan. He wasn't going to shout or fight at that table, that would only give them more reason to call him ungrateful. No, Kwame's revenge would be different. It would be quiet, powerful, and unforgettable. This was the moment everything shifted inside him. The boy they had always underestimated was gone. The man they had ignored, the man who had been building in silence, was about to rise. Kwame realized this fight was not about a Maserati anymore. It was about showing them who he truly was, about reclaiming the respect they thought they could take away. They had crossed the final line, and there was no turning back. As the laughter carried on around him, Kwame's eyes stayed sharp and cold. Deep down, he already knew, the family who had used his sacrifices to make themselves shine was about to see a side of him they had never imagined. And when that moment came, they would never forget it. Kwame's parents thought they knew him. To them, he was just their quiet, hard-working son who barely got by, the one who sacrificed so much just to keep food on the table and still managed to smile. They believed he was a dreamer who wasted money on things like cars instead of being practical. What they didn't know was that Kwame's life had another side, one he had kept hidden carefully, almost like a secret weapon. While they were busy counting his small savings and telling him how to spend it, Kwame had been building something much bigger in silence. Every late night they thought he was exhausted from his jobs, Kwame was online, studying markets, researching, and learning how money truly worked. He had invested in stocks when everyone around him thought it was too risky. He had bought pieces of real estate when others laughed at the idea of him owning property. And most importantly, he had built a digital business from scratch, a business that grew so fast it had already crossed 7 figures. The Maserati they thought was his biggest achievement. To Kwame, it was nothing more than pocket change, a small reward he gave himself out of an ocean of wealth they had no idea existed. But Kwame never bragged. He never came home waving bank statements or announcing how rich he had become. He let them believe he was still struggling, still the responsible one, who had no choice but to carry the family's weight. He understood that real power wasn't about showing off. Real power was about silence, about timing, about letting people underestimate you until the moment you decide to reveal yourself. So when they sold his car and mocked him at dinner, Kwame didn't break. He didn't scream or argue. Inside, he almost wanted to laugh. They thought they had taken everything from him, but they didn't even know who they were dealing with anymore. They were measuring him with the wrong scale, thinking they had control because they had sold one car. They had no idea that their son had enough wealth to buy not just one Maserati, but 20. Kwame's silence was not weakness, it was strategy. He had been waiting for the right time to show them what he had built, to let them see that the dreamer they pitied was already 10 steps ahead of them. He wasn't in a rush, because he knew the day he chose to reveal the truth would be unforgettable. The car was never the real prize. Respect was. And soon, very soon, they were going to learn that the quiet son they underestimated was already an empire walking right under their roof. And once that truth came out, nothing in that house would ever be the same again. That night, Kwame sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling. The anger was still there, boiling in his chest, but it was no longer just anger, it had turned into clarity. His parents thought they had power because they sold his car. They thought they could control him, that he would keep nodding and smiling like always. Alma thought her vacation made her the star of the family, parading around with her designer bags. But Kwame knew something they didn't. He knew real power wasn't about stealing a car or buying handbags. Real power was about control, about creating moments that no one could forget. And now, it was time to show them who he really was. With calm hands, he opened his laptop. His parents had no idea that in just a few clicks, he could move more money than they had seen in their entire lives. He didn't hesitate. He made a few calls to his contacts overseas, and within minutes, the plan was in motion. A quiet bank transfer, a deal confirmed, and the wheels of his revenge began to turn. It wasn't rage that guided him now, it was precision. Kwame didn't want to buy another Maserati. That would be too easy, too small. They had mocked his car, so he wanted something that would make their jaws drop and silence every laugh they had shared at his expense. He wanted something so loud, so impossible to ignore, that the entire neighborhood would remember the moment forever. As the night grew darker, Kwame leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a small smile. He didn't need to shout or confront them face to face. His silence would become his greatest weapon. His revenge wasn't going to be hidden in words, it was going to arrive in the sky, a symbol of who he truly was. By the time his parents and Alma were asleep, the surprise was already on its way to Ghana. It wasn't a gift, it wasn't a toy, it was a declaration. They had sold his car thinking they had stripped him of pride, but Kwame was about to replace it with something 100 times greater. Something they could never touch, never sell, never even dream of affording. As he lay down on his bed, there was no anger left in his heart, only calm anticipation. He pictured their faces when the truth landed, literally landed, in front of their home. He imagined Alma dropping her designer bags, his father's stunned silence, his mother's trembling hands. He could almost hear the whispers of the neighbors as they gathered to see the unbelievable. Kwame closed his eyes with a steady breath. Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. If his parents thought selling his car made them powerful, then what was coming would teach them the real meaning of power. They had taken his Maserati. In return, he was about to give them a memory they would never escape. The next evening was supposed to belong to Alma. She had just returned from Dubai, full of stories she couldn't wait to share, ready to show off the expensive perfumes, gold jewelry, and handbags she had bought. She expected the neighborhood to notice her arrival, to admire her as she rolled her suitcases through the gate. But just as she stepped out of the car with her designer glasses and fake confidence, a low, thunderous sound shook the air. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath everyone's feet. Heads turned, children stopped playing, and the neighbors poured out of their houses, staring at the sky in confusion. The rumble grew louder and louder until it was impossible to ignore. And then it appeared. Cutting across the clouds like a king entering his kingdom, a private jet descended gracefully, its engines roaring with authority. No one in that neighborhood had ever seen anything like it. A jet, here. In their area? People whispered, shouted, and pointed as the sleek white bird landed on a rented strip nearby, its polished body gleaming under the evening sun. But the true shock came when it didn't stay at the strip. Escorted by luxury vehicles and security, the jet was rolled forward, inch by inch, until it arrived directly in front of Kwame's gated driveway. The crowd gasped. Neighbors' jaws dropped as the side of the jet came into full view. There, bold and shining, was a logo stamped across it, Kwame's name. Not his family's. Not a company's. His. Alma froze mid-step, her designer bag slipping from her hands and crashing to the ground. The neighbors who had once pitied Kwame now stared at him like he was a legend walking among them. Inside the house, his parents rushed to the window. His mother's spoon slipped from her hand, clattering against the floor, while his father's eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't possible, they thought. Their responsible son, the one they treated like a helpless dreamer, now had a jet parked in their driveway. A jet with his name. The same son whose car they sold without a second thought. Alma's voice, once loud and proud, was gone. She couldn't even move. Her trip, her shopping, her stories, everything she thought made her special, meant nothing in that moment. The neighborhood wasn't looking at her anymore. They weren't asking about her vacation. Their eyes were glued to Kwame's jet, their whispers carrying his name through the evening air. The power shift was instant. The same family who mocked him less than 2 days ago now stood speechless, their world flipped upside down. The jet wasn't just a plane, it was a message, a symbol of who Kwame really was. And as the neighbors crowded closer, their phones out, recording, snapping pictures, Kwame didn't even need to say a word. His silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. That day, Alma lost her spotlight, his parents lost their control, and Kwame became the name on everyone's lips. Dinner that night was nothing like the one before. The laughter, the mocking smiles, the proud voices that had filled the room just 24 hours earlier were gone. The table was heavy with silence, so heavy it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. Kwame sat in the same chair, the same place where they had once treated him like he was small. But this time, everything had changed. He didn't rush to speak, didn't let anger spill out. He was calm, collected, his face unreadable. And that calmness was louder than any shouting could ever be. His parents avoided his eyes. His mother stirred her soup, but her hands trembled, and the spoon slipped, clattering against the bowl. His father tried to hold his composure, but his face was pale, the color drained from it as if the truth had sucked the strength out of him. Alma, usually the loudest at the table, was frozen in her seat. The same sister who had bragged about Dubai, who had smirked at him with her shiny bags, now sat staring at her plate, unable to lift her head. The sound of the jet still echoed in their minds, the image of Kwame's name painted across it still burning in their memories. Then, without raising his voice, Kwame reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of crisp documents. He placed them on the table and slowly slid them across. The words on the papers were bold and clear, legal proof of ownership, stamped and signed. The jet was his. All his. His voice was steady, almost casual, as he finally broke the silence. "Since you sold my car for her fun," he said, looking at them one by one, "I thought I'd upgrade the driveway." The words landed like thunder in the room. His mother's spoon slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. His father's eyes widened, his lips parting, but no words came out. Alma's mouth opened slightly, but nothing escaped. She had mocked his Maserati, but how could she respond now when her brother had replaced it with a private jet? Kwame didn't wait for applause or apologies. He didn't need them. The silence at that table was his victory. The fear, the awe, the shock in their eyes said more than any words could. For the first time in his life, they looked at him not as the quiet son, not as the responsible one who would carry their choices, but as someone beyond their control. He leaned back in his chair, his face calm, his presence commanding. There was no anger left in him, only power, quiet and undeniable. And in that silence, everyone at the table knew the truth. The balance had shifted forever. They could never treat him the same way again. From that dinner table moment, everything shifted. The air inside the house was different, as if invisible walls had moved. Kwame was no longer the quiet son who obeyed without question, no longer the responsible one, who carried the family's weight in silence. That version of him was gone. Sitting there with his calm eyes and steady voice, he had become something much larger. He was no longer just a man. He was an empire in flesh, and they finally saw it. His parents sat stiff, still trying to process what had happened. For years, they thought they had the power, making decisions for him, controlling what he could and couldn't do. They thought their word was final. But now they realized the truth, their control was microscopic compared to the vision Kwame had been quietly building all along. They sold his car thinking they had humbled him, but all they had done was open the door for him to reveal the scale of his world. A Maserati was nothing to him. It was pocket change. What he owned, what he had built, reached levels they couldn't even imagine. The jet outside wasn't a toy, and it wasn't about showing off to neighbors. It was a message, a declaration that Kwame's life was no longer theirs to control. He had his own destiny, his own empire, and he was steering it without their permission. For the first time, his parents and Alma realized they were not sitting across from a dreamer, but from someone who had already outgrown their limits. Alma couldn't even meet his eyes. The pride she once carried from her Dubai trip seemed laughable now, a shadow compared to the roar of a private jet in the driveway. She had mocked him, taken joy in what she thought was his downfall, but now she was the one left small, her luxury bags looking cheap next to the weight of his power. His father cleared his throat, as if trying to regain authority, but no words came. His mother kept her eyes low, ashamed and overwhelmed. They finally understood that Kwame didn't need them, not for money, not for validation, not even for approval. The boy they once dismissed had turned into a man who could command the skies. Kwame didn't boast, didn't rub it in their faces. He didn't need to. His silence, his composure, his very presence was enough. That night, he had redrawn the lines in their family. He was no longer the one being ruled. He was the ruler, the one in charge of his own destiny. And deep down, they all knew it, the power had shifted, and it was never going back. From that day forward, the family would live in the shadow of his empire, and Kwame would never again be underestimated. The silence at the table was still thick when Kwame pushed back his chair. His calmness was terrifying to them because it wasn't the calm of weakness, it was the calm of someone in complete control. Just as he stood to leave, he paused and looked at each of them, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the room. "Next time you sell what's mine," he said, "remember, I can buy what you'll never even touch." The words were simple, but they landed like a hammer. His mother's lips trembled, his father's face drained of color, and Alma's eyes filled with disbelief. They all knew he wasn't making a threat. He was speaking pure truth. Kwame didn't wait for them to reply. He turned and walked out, his footsteps slow, confident, and final. Outside, the scene was completely different. The entire neighborhood was still gathered, their phones out, whispering his name like it was already a legend. Children pointed at the jet, teenagers recorded videos, and elders shook their heads in awe. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic, something they would retell for years. Alma's Dubai trip was forgotten. Her bags were left on the ground, abandoned like useless props in a plane no one cared about anymore. The only name on people's lips was Kwame's. That night, the jet wasn't just a machine parked in the driveway, it was a symbol. It was proof that the quiet sun they had underestimated had risen above them all. It marked the end of his family's control over him and the beginning of his own legacy. In one unforgettable evening, Kwame became larger than life, not just in his home, but in the eyes of everyone who had ever doubted him.